husband fell down the basement stairs. Please, I need an ambulance, please.
2:47 a.m. He's lying at the bottom of the basement stairs, blood pooling slowly beneath his head, and he's still breathing. His wife is standing at the top of those stairs, not running down to him, not screaming for help, just standing there, watching, counting the seconds. And when she finally does walk down to him, she doesn't call 911. She kneels beside him, close enough that he can hear her, and the last thing this man ever hears in his life is his own wife whispering, "I love you," to the man she just made sure would never walk again. He died 4 hours later at a hospital, still believing she'd been asleep upstairs when he fell. She let him die believing that lie. And it would take investigators 2 years, one hidden recording device, and a man who had been secretly watching her since before her wedding day, to finally prove what really happened on that staircase. This is a story about a woman who thought she'd found the one person on earth who would never see through her. She was almost right. Stay till the end, because the person who finally exposed her wasn't a detective. It was someone far closer, who had been waiting 11 years for his moment. To understand how a woman ends up kneeling over her dying husband and whispering words of love instead of calling for help, you have to go back. Back past the affair, past the insurance policy, all the way back to the spring when none of this seemed possible at all, because this didn't start as a murder. It started, like most of these stories do, as a love story. Her name was Marissa Calloway. If you'd met her in the spring of 2011, you would have liked her immediately. She had that particular warmth some people are born with, the kind that makes strangers feel like old friends within 5 minutes. She worked the front desk at a dental office in a quiet town outside Asheville, North Carolina. She remembered everyone's birthday. She brought in banana bread on Mondays. She was the one who called elderly patients the night before their appointments just to make sure they had a ride. Nobody who knew her then would have used the word dangerous in the same sentence as her name. She'd grown up an hour outside that town, the middle child of 3, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a diner and a father who left when Marissa was 9. Friends from that time describe a girl who learned early how to read a room. Who could tell, before anyone said a word, whether a house was about to feel warm or whether it was about to feel dangerous? That skill, the ability to read people instantly and give them exactly what they needed to see, would follow her for the rest of her life. It would make her beloved. Eventually, it would make her lethal. That spring, a man named Daniel Reyes walked into that dental office for a cracked molar and walked out with her phone number. Daniel was 34, recently divorced, running his late father's construction company into modest but steady success. He was quiet in the way that made people lean in to listen. He'd inherited the business 2 years earlier when his father passed suddenly from a heart attack, and by all accounts he'd poured every part of himself into keeping it alive, showing up to job sites at dawn, learning the parts of the business he'd never been taught, trying to prove to a town full of people who'd known his father for 30 years that he could carry the name forward. Marissa was 29, single, and according to everyone who knew her, tired of being alone. Their first date was coffee that turned into dinner that turned into 4 hours of talking in a parking lot, because neither of them wanted to be the one to say goodnight first. Daniel would later tell his sister that he'd never felt so instantly understood by another person. Marissa would later tell a coworker that Daniel was the safest person I've ever met, a phrase that, years later, would take on a much darker meaning once investigators learned exactly how she used that safety. They married 11 months later in a backyard ceremony with fairy lights strung between 2 oak trees. Daniel's mother, a sharp, careful woman named Louise, cried through the entire ceremony, though not entirely from joy. She would later admit to investigators that something about Marissa had unsettled her from the very beginning. Not anything Marissa said or did, just a feeling. The kind mothers sometimes get and can never quite explain, and are usually too afraid of sounding cruel to say out loud. Louise said something quietly to Daniel 2 nights before the wedding. She asked him if he really knew this woman. Daniel laughed it off. He told his mother that Marissa was the calmest, most grounded person he'd ever met, someone who had never once raised her voice at him, never once made him feel unsure of where he stood. What Daniel didn't know, and what his mother would only learn much later, was that his mother's unease had already gone somewhere. Quietly, without telling her son, Louise had hired a private investigator a month before the wedding to look into the woman about to become part of their family. That investigator's name was Victor Ames. Friends still described the wedding as the happiest they'd ever seen either Daniel or Marissa. For the first few years, by all outward appearances, it was. They bought a modest house with a wraparound porch on the edge of town. Daniel expanded the business, hiring 2 more crews. Marissa redecorated every room herself, learned to make his grandmother's tamale recipe from a cookbook his mother gave her, hosted Sunday dinners that neighbors still talk about. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. But here is the thing about outward appearances. They are the only thing most of us ever get to see. And in this story, almost nothing was what it appeared to be. By year 4, cracks had started to show. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. Daniel's business had grown past what he could manage alone, and with growth came 12-hour days, missed dinners, a second phone he said was for work. He wasn't lying about the phone. He genuinely was drowning in the demands of a business he'd never asked to inherit, trying so hard to be worthy of his father's name that he stopped noticing his wife was slipping away from him one quiet evening at a time. Marissa, by her own later admission, began to feel like a fixture in her own home rather than a partner in it. She started confiding in a coworker at a new job she'd taken, a claims processor at a regional insurance firm. That coworker's name was Victor Ames. By then, Victor had left private investigation behind entirely. He told coworkers he'd burned out on it, too many broken marriages, too much time spent proving people's worst suspicions about each other correct. He wanted something simpler, something with regular hours and clean paperwork. What none of his coworkers knew, what Marissa herself had no idea of, was that the quiet, unremarkable man 2 cubicles down had once spent 3 weeks of his life studying hers, at the request of the mother of the man she was about to marry. Victor recognized her the moment she walked in for her first day of training. He said nothing. He simply watched her settle into the desk beside his, laughing at someone's joke in the break room, remembering a receptionist's daughter's name from a conversation weeks earlier, all the same qualities the old case file in his memory had described. He told himself it was a coincidence too strange to act on. He told himself it wasn't his business anymore. He told himself a number of things over the following months that made it easier to simply let the days pass without saying a word. Victor was easy to talk to. He listened in a way Daniel had stopped listening, not because Daniel didn't care, but because Daniel had nothing left at the end of most days to give. Victor remembered the small things Marissa mentioned once in passing, a childhood dog's name, an offhand comment about wanting to visit the coast, the fact that she took her coffee with too much cream because it reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. Within a year, what began as lunch break venting had become something else entirely. Something Marissa would later describe, chillingly, in a police interview, as the only place I felt like myself. By year 7 of the marriage, Marissa and Victor were involved in a full affair. It started, as these things often do, with something that felt harmless. A ride home after her car wouldn't start. A late dinner after a long shift that turned into 2 hours of conversation neither of them wanted to end. A hand that lingered half a second too long on a shoulder. By the time either of them could have called it what it was, it had already stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling, to both of them, like inevitability. And by year 8, according to phone records later recovered by investigators, the conversation between them had shifted from longing to something far colder: planning. Here, what makes this case different from 100 others like it? Marissa didn't want a divorce. Divorce meant splitting assets, lawyers, a fight in front of a town that had watched her play the devoted wife for 8 years. Divorce meant Daniel might walk away with half of everything, including the business he'd built from the wreckage of his father's death. Divorce, more than anything, meant admitting to everyone she knew that the life she'd performed so beautifully had been a performance all along. What Marissa wanted, what she told Victor she wanted, in a message investigators would later read aloud in a courtroom, was a clean ending. Those were her words, a clean ending. Daniel had a life insurance policy worth $800,000, taken out years earlier when the business was young, and he wanted to protect his new wife if anything happened to him. He'd sat across from an insurance agent, newly married, thinking about nothing more sinister than making sure Marissa would never have to worry about money if the worst happened on a job site. He trusted her enough to make her the sole beneficiary. He trusted her enough to never think, not even once in 8 years, to check whether that trust was still deserved. Investigators would later reconstruct the months leading up to Daniel's death almost entirely from Victor's recordings. Recordings Victor claims he began, at first, purely to protect himself, in case Marissa's plan ever went wrong and someone came looking for someone to blame. Whatever his original reason, those recordings captured something no courtroom could later dispute. Two people, over the course of nearly a year, calmly discussing the safest way to make sure a healthy 38-year-old man ended up dead in a way that would never raise a single question. They discussed his habits, his late-night trips to the basement to check on the water heater, something he did almost every night before bed, out of the same careful diligence that had made him so good at running a business he never asked for. They discussed the loose stair tread he'd been meaning to fix for months, the one he always joked he'd get to eventually. They discussed timing, how a fall needed to happen late enough that no one would question why she'd been asleep, and early enough that there would be no ambiguity about how long he'd have been lying there before help arrived. In one recording from 3 weeks before his death, Marissa says, plainly, without a trace of hesitation in her voice, "It has to look like exactly what it is. An accident. He trusts me completely. That's the whole point." On the night of February 14th, 2019, a detail investigators would later note with a particular kind of quiet horror. Given what day it was, Daniel Reyes went to bed the same way he had for 11 years. He kissed his wife goodnight. He told her he loved her. He had no reason in the world to believe those words weren't being returned exactly as they seemed. What happened next would only fully come to light 2 years later, pieced together from Victor's recordings and Marissa's own words under interrogation. Sometime after midnight, Daniel woke to check the basement, exactly as he always did. Marissa followed him down. What was waiting for him at the bottom of those stairs wasn't an accident of a loose stair tread he'd simply never fixed. It was a stair tread Marissa had loosened herself 3 days earlier, using a screwdriver she later disposed of at a hardware store's recycling bin 40 minutes from their home. At 2:47 a.m., Daniel Reyes fell. He did not die instantly. Marissa would later admit this under questioning, that he was conscious at the bottom of those stairs, that he called her name, that she stood at the top and waited, watching, for nearly 4 full minutes before she came down to him. When she finally knelt beside him, she did not call for help. She told him she loved him. She let him believe, in what would turn out to be some of the last coherent moments of his life, that the woman holding his hand was heartbroken over what had happened to him rather than the reason it had happened at all. She called 911 at 3:14 a.m., 27 minutes after the fall. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. Daniel was taken to the hospital in critical condition, suffering from a traumatic brain injury, and died just after 7 a.m. that morning, with his wife at his bedside, weeping in a way that convinced every nurse and doctor in that room that they were watching the single worst moment of a devoted woman's life. For a while, it worked. The initial investigation ruled Daniel's death an accidental fall. Marissa told police she'd been asleep upstairs and hadn't heard him get up, waking only to the sound of him calling her name from the bottom of the stairs. She wept in front of the responding officers. She wept at the funeral, where over 200 people came to pay respects to a man the whole town had loved. She wept, convincingly, for months, at the grocery store when someone offered condolences, at the office when a coworker asked how she was holding up, in every single moment where someone might have been watching. The insurance company paid out within 90 days of Daniel's death. Marissa inherited the house, the business, and $800,000. 6 months later, she quietly resigned from her job at the insurance firm. 8 months later, she sold the construction company, the one Daniel had spent years trying to prove he was worthy of, to a competitor for a fraction of what it was worth, simply to be free of it. 10 months later, Neighbors say she and Victor Ames were seen together so often that it stopped being a secret at all. Within a year, Victor had moved into the house Daniel had once shared his life in. And this is where most crime stories would end, the guilty parties living comfortably on a dead man's money, no one left to ask questions, a small town slowly moving on the way small towns do. But this is where the story becomes something else entirely. Because Marissa made one mistake that would take almost 2 years to catch up with her. She trusted Victor completely. And Victor had spent those 2 years quietly building a case file of his own. What Marissa never knew, what almost no one in this story knew until the very end, was that Victor Ames had once worked as a private investigator, hired 11 years earlier by Daniel's mother, Louise, for the express purpose of investigating the woman her son was about to marry. Victor had cleared her back then, found nothing suspicious in her past, no red flags, no reason to worry. He told Louise she was exactly who she said she was, a working-class woman with a hard childhood and a genuine desire for a stable life. He'd closed the file, been paid for his work, and moved on, never imagining that years later, fate would place him at a claims desk 2 cubicles down from the very woman he'd once investigated. Victor recognized her the first day. He never told her. For years, investigators believe, Victor let the relationship develop, and eventually let the plan against Daniel unfold in front of him, while secretly recording nearly every conversation on a personal device he kept, initially, he claims, purely as self-protection. Whether Victor's silence in those early months was born of genuine attraction, curiosity, self-interest, or something colder, is a question that would come to define how the public perceived him for years afterward. What is certain is that, by the time Daniel died, Victor Ames had in his possession nearly 18 months of recorded conversation documenting, in Marissa's own voice, the planning of a murder. He did nothing with those recordings for almost 2 years. It was an anonymous tip, never fully traced, though investigators believe it may have come from Louise, Daniel's mother, who had never stopped quietly questioning the official story of her son's death, that finally reopened the case in late 2020. A detective named Rosa Alvarez, newly assigned to cold cases in the department, requested a second look at the original medical examiner's report. Small inconsistencies emerged. The angle of the head injury didn't perfectly match a simple backward fall. The timeline between the estimated time of injury and the 911 call left an unexplained gap of nearly half an hour. None of it, on its own, was enough for an arrest. But it was enough to make Detective Alvarez start asking questions again. Quietly, carefully, the way you do when you suspect you might be reopening something someone worked very hard to close. When investigators eventually reached out to Victor Ames, initially only as a witness who'd known the couple socially, something in him broke open. Whether it was guilt that had been building for 2 years, or the simple recognition that the walls were finally closing in regardless of what he did, Victor handed over his recordings voluntarily, meticulously organized, time-stamped down to the second. 18 months of Marissa Calloway's own voice, laying out, in her own words, exactly how and why her husband was going to die. When Detective Alvarez played that final recording for the first time, Marissa's voice saying, "It has to look like exactly what it is, an accident. He trusts me completely. That's the whole point." She would later tell a colleague it was the single coldest sentence she'd heard in 11 years on the force. Marissa Calloway was arrested on March 3, 2021, at the same house where Daniel had once made his own quiet way down to the basement every night before bed. Reportedly, before her lawyer could stop her from saying anything else, she turned to detectives and asked one question. "Where?" "Victor." She still believed, even then, standing in handcuffs in her own kitchen, that he was the one person in the world who would never betray her. He was in a separate interview room 3 miles away, already halfway through his second cup of coffee. The trial began in the summer of 2022 and lasted 11 days. Prosecutors played the recordings in full for the jury, including the final one, the one where Marissa discusses, in a voice witnesses in the courtroom described as unnervingly calm, exactly what clean ending meant to her. Daniel's mother, Louise, testified on the third day, describing the unease she'd felt before the wedding and the investigation she'd quietly commissioned over a decade earlier. An investigation that, without either of them ever knowing it at the time, would end up saving the case against her son's killer more than a decade later. She wept on the stand, not for the loss of her son twice over, once in life, once again in the courtroom hearing exactly how it happened, but for the years she'd spent doubting her own instincts about the woman who'd been sitting at her family's dinner table the entire time. The defense argued that Victor Ames bore equal responsibility, that he had known about the plan for months and did nothing to stop it, effectively allowing a murder to happen in order to build a case that served his own interests. The jury didn't disagree, not entirely. But under the law, knowledge of a crime without direct participation in causing the death was not enough to charge him as a co-conspirator, and prosecutors ultimately determined there was insufficient evidence that Victor had played any active role in the murder itself, beyond failing to report what he suspected until it was already too late. Marissa Calloway was convicted of first-degree murder and insurance fraud on the 11th day of trial and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. She showed no visible emotion when the verdict was read. The same composure, witnesses noted, that had once made her so convincing as a grieving widow now read, in a courtroom full of people who knew the truth, as something closer to horror. Victor Ames was never charged. He testified for the prosecution, providing the recordings and testimony that ultimately convicted the woman he had once loved, or claimed to love, or perhaps simply studied closely enough to know exactly how to survive her. He moved out of state within a year of the trial's conclusion. He kept the coffee habit. To this day, people in that small North Carolina town remain deeply split on Victor Ames. Some call him a quiet hero, a man who ultimately did the right thing and brought a murderer to justice, regardless of how long it took him to act. Others believe he let an innocent man die simply to see how far Marissa would go, and only turned on her once he'd gotten everything, the relationship, the house, the money, the story that he ever wanted from her in the first place. Both things, disturbingly, might be true. It's entirely possible for a person to be both the one who finally exposes a monster and someone who let that monster do exactly what she was going to do before lifting a single finger to stop her. What this case leaves behind isn't just a conviction. It's a question worth sitting with long after the verdict. Marissa Calloway believed, for 8 years, that she had found the one person on earth who would never see through her, the one person who would let her be exactly who she truly was without judgment or consequence. She was almost right. He saw through her from the very beginning, from before she ever put on a wedding dress, before she ever whispered a single word of love to a man who didn't deserve what was coming for him. Victor simply chose, for reasons only he will ever fully understand, to watch the whole thing happen first, and to keep his own reasons to himself long after everyone else had stopped asking. Love in this story was never the truth. It was the cover. The disguise two people wore so convincingly that it took a detective, an anonymous tip, and 18 months of hidden recordings just to prove what had been happening underneath it the entire time. And the most dangerous person in the room was never the one who seemed like a liar. It was the one who never stopped listening and never once said a word. If this story kept you here until the very end, you already know why we call this channel Psych Files. There's always more beneath the surface than anyone standing on the outside can see, and the next case we cover proves that even more than this one did. Subscribe, because you won't want to miss it.